when you take a look at American history, particularly at America's wars, we have an unbelievable record. We're something like 10-1, 11-1, which is a enviable record from a military standpoint. The problem is war is but a means to an end. And the end game, to borrow something from the Avengers, is more or less the peace treaty that's constructed after the war, the shape of the world to come, or the area in which the war took place. That is where the real victory lies. And that is where we have a great many shortcomings. Take a look at the war against Iraq in 2003, and then in Afghanistan in 2002, and ongoing problems still to this day. So we're going to take a look at one of those earlier problems, a problem which would lead to a greater and even bigger war, and would set the stage for this country well into the 21st century. So let's take a look at the Treaty of Versailles and how that treaty, primarily using Woodrow Wilson as an architect, led to a greater, even more terrible war. When the surrender took place, and if you take a look at those headlines on the streets of Washington, D.C., it says Germany surrenders. In fact, that's not accurate. There was an armistice, 11/11/11, November 11th, at 11 a.m. An armistice was signed, a ceasefire, if you will. And that ceasefire, for all intents and purposes, yes, the war was over. But the details of the treaty, which would officially end that war and put each of the victorious and losing powers in a particular place, that had yet to be worked out. And it was Woodrow Wilson who had laid the foundation for that. Wilson's 14 points, issued during the war, presented before Congress, and those presentations would be used in numerous times to reject earlier pleas by the Central Powers to come to some type of armistice. And Wilson would say, no, you have to accept all of the 14 points prior to that, which was basically a surrender. And that was something they were not willing to do at that point in time. Now,
what could I do to top this?
How did he top this? What were his 14 points? January 8th, 1918. We still were not fully involved in the war and only had maybe, by that time, maybe 30, 40,000 troops over in Europe. He was taking a look at the world after the war. Remember, this was a war to make the world safe for democracy, or as he also put it, a war to end all wars. And that was one of the ways that he was able to secure the American people's full participation and support for that war. 9 out of the 14 points, as you see there, deal with something called self-determination of nations, the right of people to govern themselves. The idea here was specifically dealing with one of the causes of the war, and that was with nationalism, extreme pride in your country. And remember, a nation state at that time was a nation that was unified in culture, in language, sometimes in religion, and of course in history. Well, that had not been the case in Europe with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. That had not been the case with certain areas controlled by Russia, certain areas controlled by England and France, and the list goes on. So the original idea was that all like peoples would be under their own self-rule or be united with the country that they originally were part of. That's not going to be the case. Territorial disputes are going to be settled. They had festered for a long time. Alsace-Lorraine is the most famous. That particular area ping-ponged back and forth between France and Germany since the 1870s. And once and for all, supposedly, this was going to be settled. Again, it's not going to be the case. Poland, all of a sudden, is going to become a player in all of this. And he's taking a look, Wilson that is, at the modern causes of war. Secret diplomacy, secret treaties, violation of freedom of the seas, and trade barriers. And that, of course, particularly impacted the United States and was one of the reasons with this unrestricted submarine warfare that we get into the war. But the single biggest point of the 14 was the 14th, the last point. And that was Wilson's baby, if you will, the League of Nations. This was going to be an international organization which would peacefully resolve any issues that would come up in the future. And if, as it turns out, one nation was attacked, then all other nations, it's a Three Musketeers type of thing, one for all and all for one, that all the other nations would come to that nation's aid, hopefully serving as a deterrent against any and all future wars. So when Wilson presented this to Congress, as you see there, this is what we should demand. And again, it's one thing to ask, it's another thing for it to be granted. If you take a look at these, again, all idealistic, and that fits in exactly with Wilson's personality. He was the ultimate idealist, and if you remember him as a person, remember, God spoke to him. And so when you're taking a look at these things, he found it very difficult to compromise. And as you see there, the only just program for peace is my 14 points, not ours, not the world's, but his 14 points. So he had a personal stake in all of this, something in politics which can be rather deadly. So, point number one, open covenants of peace openly arrived at. So once again, the disappearance of secret treaties. That way there would be no misjudgment, no mistakes, no errors in calculating the strength of another side, if you will. And in that way, hope to avoid miscalculations and future wars. Absolute freedom of the seas. So neutral countries, example, United States, at the beginning of World War I, would be exempted from blockades or attacks by now the new and deadly weapon, the submarine. No more tariffs. That way, goods and people could openly transfer back and forth between nations, thus removing certain nations having advantages. And of course, that's the very thing that plagues Great Britain today. And if you're following the news with Brexit, their attempt to pull out of the European Union, or what's sometimes known as the common market, we, under Trump, have constantly derided some of the economic unions that we're in. We pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we renegotiated the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Association agreement, and we're thinking about pulling out of others. Now, some of the problems with Wilson's 14 points. Number one, the United States Senate makes treaties. Though the president can propose, it is the Senate which disposes. So he can advise, but the Senate must give its consent. Unlike other nations in which the people who attend the treaty making sessions have the power to sign and commit their nations to those treaties. One of the difficulties, which is going to stick in the throat of many United States senators, was something called Article 10. Now that's Article 10 of Article 14. And Article 10 said that each member nation of the League would fight to preserve the independence of all other nations. Again, the three musketeers.
Now this really pisses me off to no end.
And you see focused on there is Warren G. Harding. Harding, who will become Republican candidate for president of the United States, will argue for something called a return to normalcy. A return to normalcy. There is no such word as normalcy. Harding made it up. And in so doing, struck a chord with the United States. Because when the Versailles negotiations are complete, we felt that all the victories that we had won in the trenches were lost in the treaty-making sessions. So we wanted just to, in effect, bury our heads in the sand and forget Europe. Wilson, when he goes to Europe, and we've talked about this before, he's the first United States president to leave our shores and go to Europe while still being president, goes to Europe as a conquering hero. The United States' entry into the war and the subsequent presentation of the League of Nations and the 14 points is viewed as visionary, far-reaching, and here is a man of the people. Now, that's how he's looked upon by the people of Europe, who were stunned by the slaughter which took place on the battlefields of France and Eastern Europe. When he goes to Paris, millions, that's right, millions, will crowd the streets along the Champs-Élysées and cheer him. Here was a man who had ended the war for goals that the people could appreciate. Now, again, he's already made the promise that the 14 points must be the basis for peace. Keep that in mind with his idealism, his messianic complex, and now you've got the cheers of entire nations ringing in your ear. It's going to make it very difficult for Wilson to see anything else but himself as the centerpiece, along with his League of Nations.
But when it was all over, the statesman went to discuss the peace treaty at Versailles, armed only with 19th century prejudices. The idealism of President Woodrow Wilson would soon be shattered by the harsh practicalities of his European partners. They were determined that never again would the Germans have the opportunity of ravaging France. The treaty dismembered Germany and its allies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. These large and powerful states were to be broken up so that the various ethnic groups they contained would have their own separate countries. Unfortunately, however, this checkerboard of small independent nations would prove to be too weak to defend itself against an embittered and vengeance-seeking Germany. Instead of healing old wounds, the Treaty of Versailles only succeeded in creating a new discontent. More drastic solutions would soon replace the fumbling of the diplomats.
There's an old story. You hear it every year when a rookie goes into the NFL and he gets blindsided or tackled particularly hard or smacked when he's going out of bounds with the ball. And then there's always some grizzled veteran that stands over him and says, "Welcome to the NFL." Well, this was Wilson. He was the rookie going into this peace conference. And when he got there, they essentially said, "Welcome to the big time." Over 200 nations attended the treaty process at Versailles. Out of that 200, you had a council of 10, which actually did the writing of the treaty. And out of that 10, you had the big four. And that's going to be Italy, the United States, Great Britain, and of course, France. The big four. We'll talk about the individuals who represented their nations in a second. But Wilson finally realizes that to have any influence at all in these negotiations, he was going to have to compromise. But what he insists upon, and they give him, is his League of Nations. His thinking was simple. All right, I don't get the other 13 points, if you will, but if I get the League of Nations, then that all-encompassing international organization can eventually institute some of the things that we wanted to see down the road. The big four: Lloyd George of England, Clemenceau of France, Orlando from Italy, and of course Wilson from the United States. Clemenceau once said during the war, "My policy is war, my end game is war, that is what I do, I make war." Spoken by an old man who had never set foot on the battlefield. While participating in the negotiations on March 4th, 1919, Wilson is going to receive a round-robin letter that will be distributed to all of the American press. And it is signed by senators within the United States Senate. Now, keep this in mind. In getting approval for a negotiated treaty, you need a 2/3 majority. It's not just a simple majority. And Wilson was right at the line where he might not be able to push his goal any further. You're going to have two groups of senators. One is called the irreconcilables. They are opposed to the treaty in any way, shape, or form. Part of it is because they don't like Wilson. Part of it is because they don't want to lose American freedom to the League of Nations. And part of it is they believe in total isolationism. The other group, the reservationists, led by an individual that we'll discuss shortly, a gentleman by the name of Henry Cabot Lodge, they were opposed to the League, or not to the League, but to the treaty itself, unless there were certain compromises. Now, keep that in mind, unless there were certain compromises. You see the political cartoon there. Here comes the draft of the League of Nations along with the treaty, landing on America's shores, and there to greet them at the beach are the quote-unquote Republican hostiles. And that is where he is going to have his problems. There are parts of the treaty which Wilson fought against, but were included anyway. One, and the most damning of them, would be reparations. Think of the word reparations, repair. The European nations, particularly France, but with some support by Great Britain and Belgium wanted to be paid back for the damages inflicted by the war and paid back by Germany to the tune of $33 billion. If you were to take that in today's money, we're talking about in the trillions. Now let's go back for a second. France, in order to reject some of the things that Wilson objected to, said, okay, fine, we'll forego some of our objections to your 14 points as long as you promise to come to our aid if we're ever attacked again by Germany. You can understand France's hesitancy. 1870, she's invaded during the Franco-Prussian War and conquered. 1914, once again, she's invaded and almost conquered again. And the bulk of the war is fought on her territory. But the United States rejects doing that. And so France is going to make sure that Germany is not going to be able to rise up again and once again threaten French security. May 7th, 1919, 200-page treaty with no League of Nations. Now, one of the things that is going to be presumed will be something that is going to be referred to as the war guilt clause. Now, when I say presumed, if Germany is responsible for paying the damages that were inflicted during the war, then that presumes, just like an insurance policy, that you were at fault and therefore you're liable for the damages. Any person with experience with car insurance knows that. Well, that becomes known as the war guilt clause, that Germany is made to assume full responsibility for the war, and therefore Germany must pay for it. Was it totally on her? No. All the nations have some hand in the debacle that was about to take place. However, Germany did share the bulk of responsibility. So that was something that much later on, a corporal in the Austrian army would later use to rise to power, and that corporal's name was Adolf Hitler. One of the things in the treaty was the self-determination of nations. But as you take a close look at the map, you're going to see that that was not adhered to. Sections of Germany are ripped away and given to Poland. And that becomes known as, if you take a look on the screen, as the Polish corridor. That's her way to the sea. So here's part of Germany, here's part of Germany, and this part of Germany, dividing them, is going to go over to Poland. You're going to see areas taken from Germany and given to Denmark. You're going to see areas, primarily Alsace-Lorraine, down in here, and then the industrialized part of Germany and the part where she gets her coal from, given over to France as a protectorate, no longer given to Germany. And here is the problem. That's like saying, I take away your checkbook and then tell you that you've got to pay me $1,000. Well, if you can't write checks, how can you pay off the money? They've just taken away Germany's checkbook and now expect her to pay the money implied in the war guilt clause and in reparations. Now, take a look. That's what Europe looked like prior to World War I. Take a look at what the new Europe looks like after the war. It is a time bomb. Finland taken away from Russia. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, again, all taken away from Russian domination. There's the Polish corridor, the new nation of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia. There's other nations down there. But entwined in those nations, for example, let's take Czechoslovakia, are about 8 million Germans. in an area known as the Sudetenland. Well, what happened to self-determination? What happened to realizing that nationalism helped lead to World War I? And instead, these deals are made. And these cut-ups, if you will, are going to extend into Africa and Asia. So all over the world, Germany is going to be stripped of everything that she has, and it's going to be given, instead of them becoming independent, given to other victorious nations, particularly France. Meanwhile, in the United States, you have a desire to return to isolationism. What happened to the 14 points, which were supposed to be the basis for an end to the war? We only get one, and that initially was not included in the treaty. Only after Wilson complains is it inserted. In the United States, you've got conservatives who feel that the treaty wasn't harsh enough, that you really needed to step on Germany. You have the liberals who felt that it was too harsh. And then you have what are known as the hyphens, the German Americans, the Italian Americans, and so on, each feeling that their homeland did not get a fair shake at the treaty negotiations. So there's a split.
These guns are identical to the one that killed Jim Johnson. Watch carefully as I test fire this gun into these videotapes of Barbara Walters' interviews.
Well, those guns are aimed right at Europe. Again, you see a better example of the things that were stripped away from Germany, but take a look in the middle at the box where it says principal German losses. 100% of her colonies, 80% of her fleet. Some of her fleet would be sunk on orders from the German admiral before Britain could take them over. And that's one of the reasons why the British started to side with the French during the negotiations. 48% of all her iron. And then go down coal, territory, 12% of her population. Again, self-determination of nations. You know, all those things are going to be things that Hitler is going to be able to use to secure the support of the German people on his climb up the ladder of power, and eventually plunging the world into a second and even more horrible war. Wilson now goes home trying to argue that he's made the world safe for democracy. The only thing that was definitely established would be, and it's still in existence today, the World Court, which is at The Hague in the Netherlands. So Uncle Sam, rather disappointed. And again, it's Article 10.
We now consecrate the bond of obedience. Assume the position.
Article 10, which talks about collective security, is going to get a thumbs down. William Randolph Hearst, editor of some of the most powerful newspapers in the United States, talks about 100% Americanism. Maybe that phrase isn't being used today, but it's still, idea is still floating around out there. Take a look at some of the ultra right-wing groups, the QAnons, and some others that push this idea. And Hearst, when Wilson returns with the treaty, now including the League of Nations, the American people are not so all fired up to accept it, with people like Hearst pushing that idea. So the slump of idealism, again, making the world safe for democracy, is starting to lose its appeal. This man,
I tell you, I don't get no respect at all.
Senator Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts, Lodge, whose son in the 1960s will run with Richard Nixon for the executive branch against the Kennedys in 1960. Lodge, the father, a Republican. Lodge, a lifelong friend of Teddy Roosevelt, who is extremely critical of the treaty, though shortly thereafter, Teddy Roosevelt is going to pass away. We'll talk more about that in a second. But Lodge leads the group of senators opposed to the League with reservations. So if Wilson had been willing to compromise with Lodge, then the treaty would have passed. Forget the irreconcilables. They didn't have enough members to stop its passage. But when you combine the irreconcilables and the reservationists, well, that's just about all the Republican senators in the United States Senate. The Republicans are attempting to stall for time, to drag out the hearings so that they could garner enough support to stop the, I'm going to talk about the League, but of course we're talking about the entire treaty, from being accepted. Wilson then decides to go over their heads and appeal directly to the American people. He's going to embark upon what's known in politics back in that era as a whistle-stop campaign. In taking his League of Nations directly to the American people, he's hoping to gain their support and thus put a lot of pressure on wavering senators to vote in his favor. When he announces his idea of what he's going to do, two things happen. Number one, his doctor, Admiral Grayson, cautions him against doing this. Wilson was sick, and he was afraid that this tour could lead to his death with all the strain and stress that was going to go along with it. The other thing was, right behind his train would be the Republican truth train. So wherever Wilson went, as soon as he left, they would follow up and present their side of the story. When Wilson finally gets to Arizona, he's going to give a speech, and there he's going to collapse. He is put on a train and rushed back to Washington, D.C., and then while there, he's going to suffer a full-blown stroke, which for the most part is going to be hidden from the American people. And for all intents and purposes, during this time period, his wife is going to be run the presidency. You take a look at the headlines there. His doctor declines to discuss the rumors. Think about all of the criticisms for Trump's doctor once he got COVID. Wilson dangerously ill. How sick? Well, we don't know. Now, just to backtrack for a second, Wilson's first wife had died while he was in office, and he grieved for about 6 months, and then he remarried. A Washington socialite who he met while playing golf, Edith Galt, will become the apple of his eye. They will marry, and it is Edith Galt, who, along with Dr. Grayson, will hide the true extent of Wilson's illness from not only the American people, but from Congress. At various times, congressmen would come to try to visit Wilson, and Galt would time it so that when Wilson was at his best, they could come into the room. He'd be sitting up in his bed, laughing, smiling, joking, with Edith Galt standing directly between the president and the members of Congress who were trying to assess whether Wilson was truly capable of running the country. Galt is the one that issued the various directives coming from the president, but not coming from the president as he was, but as he was before. and therefore no compromise. So Edith would hand out orders to the various minions, if you will, of Wilson, not to compromise when the treaty was being discussed in the Senate. And eventually, of course, the treaty would be defeated. And the United States would sign a separate treaty with Germany, and she would not join the League of Nations. Take a look at the 1920 election. Wilson does not run again. He served 2 terms, and he could have run, but he didn't. Obviously, physically, he wasn't able to. The Democrat James Cox, along with his vice presidential running mate, a man by the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt, later known as FDR, ran on a platform which totally supported the treaty and the League of Nations. Harding, Republican from Ohio, campaigned in Ohio, never left the state, just as a previous Republican candidate, McKinley, did. Harding, the return to normalcy, as you can see, captures most of the states. It's only the Solid South that stands behind Wilson. Solid South, and they voted usually Democratic, again going back to the Civil War. And Wilson saw this as a final rejection of his stance on the treaty and the League of Nations. So the League of Nations was doomed to failure. The 3 great powers were members. We were not. And as you see in that political cartoon, it was a 3-legged table. We would go as an observer, but we would not participate. And the League would be constantly challenged. Japan would thumb its nose. Germany would rip up the Treaty of Versailles and begin to rearm under Hitler. Italy would start an invasion of Africa, and Haile Selassie, the leader of Ethiopia, would beg the League of Nations to live up to the covenant by which collective security was promised. And of course, they did not. So the results of the war: the map of Europe totally redrawn, new boundaries, the rise of communism in the USSR, the dynasties that collapse, leading to a redrawing of the map and new alliances and new enemies. Europe was destroyed. Remember, the bulk of the war was fought in Europe, and that is going to lead to a tremendous advantage in the United States. We would provide most of their food, particularly right after the war and during the war. We would provide most of the goods that were going to be purchased. So we become the #1 industrial power in the world. And of course, you could walk the streets of most European capitals and not find an individual between the ages of 30 and 20 because of the deaths that had taken place during World War I. Eventually, it's going to lead in Europe to a severe economic depression, which is going to leak into the United States, as we all know. One of the things in war is that you either step so hard on your enemy that he has any hesitancy about rising up again, or that you accept them as part of the group and ease them back into the community. The treaty did neither. It stepped on them, but just enough to get them angry, and it did not ease them in. They still felt like they were outsiders. So the anger and hatred in Germany bubbled up below the surface. And again, it was Hitler who was able to benefit by all of that. Women in the United States, as a result of the war, are going to get the right to vote. And that was a deal made by Wilson and the women's suffrage movement. If they would get behind the war effort, he promised them that he would push for women's right to vote. Now, ironically, the women are going to make a rather strange alliance with two other groups. One, the Anti-Saloon League, the ASL. We'll talk about them when we talk about the Roaring Twenties. They were one of the most powerful interest groups ever in American history, and they are going to push for, of course, prohibition. The other group that they make an alliance with in order to get the right to vote will be the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan is going to make a reappearance and resurgence during the 1920s. So that, along with Wilson's promise, was enough to get support to give them the 19th Amendment and, of course, the right to vote. Now, we've heard enough of this during the last few months as everybody makes the comparison between the current pandemic that we are experiencing and the epidemic between 1918 and 1919. 500 million people will die worldwide. 1/3 of the planet's population. We spend more money between 1917 and 1918 than in the previous 125 years combined. Pardon me. Now, if you were taking a look at the headlines in today's paper, we are now in debt over $3 trillion. Keep in mind, in the year 2000, Clinton's last year in office, we had a plus in our budget. We were 500 billion to the good. We are now 3 trillion in debt. Our war industry was totally unprepared, and most of our supplies actually came from the European powers. The Treaty of Versailles is going to lead to the rise of fascism in both Germany and Italy. Italy will be the first under Mussolini. There you see pictured next to Hitler. And the cost, economically, casualty-wise, lives lost. You see that we lose 116,000, 350,000 casualties, 8% of our population. England and Russia, 76%, Germany, 65%, Austria-Hungary, 90%. And there is what Wilson said. When Wilson went to the inauguration of Warren G. Harding, as the president who is leaving generally does, will be interesting to see if Trump loses, will he go to the inauguration of Biden? But be that as it may, Wilson went, and he hired a security firm to guard him when he went back to his Georgetown townhouse. Not one person came to say goodbye. So obviously he did not need the security service. Later, when he attends a couple years down the road, a ceremony inaugurating what we now know is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, taking an unknown World War I body, putting it in the tomb to represent all of those who did not come home and remain unknown and perhaps unburied. Wilson will go to that and kind of is looked upon a little bit different by the American people. But if you take a look at what he says there, the people will have to learn now by bitter experience. We had a chance to gain leadership and we lost it. Typical Woodrow Wilson. As you see, coming too soon will be World War II, just 20 years down the road. But in between time will come an era in American history called the Roaring Twenties. And that is what we'll take a look at next.